it's still hard for me to think about. I'm sorry.
Nick Hogan has made it on the news again, and it's for all the wrong reasons. Nick recently got arrested for a DUI, and while no lives were lost or affected badly, it wasn't that long that he did the same exact thing.
I will never, ever be able to say I'm sorry enough.
But that time, so many lives changed forever. And now, Nick's new arrest could finally ruin his life once and for all. And you won't believe how. Nick got arrested on the 18th of November 2023, and it's really not looking good for Hulk Hogan's son. Nick got arrested on suspicion of a DUI by Clearwater police officers. And the circumstances surrounding the arrest are just crazy, because just hours earlier, Nick was at his dad's restaurant, Hogan's Hangout. And it wasn't just any regular day at the restaurant. The restaurant was hosting a bikini contest. Of course, Hulk was a judge for this particular contest, while Nick was in the DJ booth. Nick was also the MC for the contest, so he was introducing the contestants and keeping everyone entertained. Now, if that was all Nick had done, maybe he wouldn't have been in as much trouble as he is in right now. But it looks like while doing all of that for the bikini contest, Nick somehow managed to get himself a couple of drinks. And by a couple, I mean a lot, judging by what the officer who stopped Nick said. For some reason, after a while in the restaurant, Nick thought it would be a good idea to get behind a steering wheel. I'm not sure why he thought this would be okay, but he did it. While Nick was driving, he drove past about 3 patrol cars that were on the side of the road attending to a traffic incident. As Nick was approaching the patrol cars, an officer tried to signal to him that he should switch lanes. So that way he would be giving the officer some space to deal with what they already had on their hands. But Nick was not showing any signs of changing lanes or even slowing down. And while he was coming toward the officers, they took a reading of the speed Nick was driving at, and apparently it clocked Nick driving at 51 miles per hour in his 2021 Dodge Ram pickup truck. The only problem was that Nick was on a 40-mile-per-hour road, so he was way over the limit. This already sounds pretty bad, but trust me, it gets even worse. Because the officers tried to pull him over, and let's just say that it wasn't exactly the smoothest pullover ever. Because after the sirens came on, it still took a while before Nick drove his truck off the road and stopped. So by this point, the officers already had their suspicions that everything was not as it should be. But then it still got worse, because according to the officer that pulled Nick over, they noticed that there was a very distinct smell of adult beverages coming from Nick and the car. And not just that, there were reportedly also some other signs, like Nick's eyes looking bloodshot at the time. So naturally, the officer asked Nick to take a field sobriety test. It should be pretty clear by now that Nick did not pass the sobriety test, so the officer detained Nick, but eventually he was bailed out after paying $500. Now that might not seem so bad. Luckily, nothing too bad happened and no one was injured. But there's a twist, because this wasn't the first time that Nick ran into trouble with the law in Clearwater, but last time it was way worse, and it also involved a car and some drinking. This happened about 16 years ago in August 2007. At the time, Nick was only 17 years old. Back then, Nick wasn't actually driving alone. He was with his friend John Graziano in a yellow Toyota Supra. John was 22 years old and a U.S. Marine. According to reports, Nick and John were speeding in the car until Nick lost control of the car, and then it spun off the highway and crashed into a palm tree. After the crash, Nick and John were rescued and taken to a hospital. Somehow, Nick escaped with only minor injuries, but unfortunately, John had a broken skull and suffered some brain damage, and because of the brain damage, he was in a vegetative state. So John was going to need a lifetime of full-time medical care. While they were speeding in the car, Nick had a seatbelt on, while John, on the other hand, was riding without a seatbelt in the front passenger seat. After Nick recovered from his minor injuries, he was charged with felony reckless driving. Nick pleaded no contest and was sentenced to 8 months in Pinellas County Jail, but he got out after only serving 6 months and was placed on very long probation. The probation lasted for about 5 years, but that was not the only punishment Nick got after coming out of jail. He also had to put in 500 hours of community service, and his driver's license was suspended for 3 years. Still, that was not the end of the case, because John's mother, Deborah Graziano, sued and got a settlement of about $5 million. Sometime later, Nick confessed that he was traumatized by the crash, and that it only got worse when he found out about what happened to John. So you would think that with all that happened, Nick would have learned how to drive below the speed limit, but it doesn't look like he's learned his lesson. And when the news of Nick being arrested for another DUI became public, Deborah had a lot to say. Firstly, she said that she was not surprised that Nick would wind up with another DUI even after what happened the first time. According to Deborah, Nick is as careless now as he was 16 years ago when the crash happened. She also said that she thought it was extremely disrespectful for Nick to be driving recklessly on the road, considering what happened to her son and the fact that John is still in the state he is because of Nick's driving. And when you think about it, she's not wrong. But Deborah didn't stop there. In fact, she added that not only did the accident change the course of John's life permanently, but it also affected their whole family, because suddenly John needed to be looked after full time. And even though he was physically present, Deborah still had to mourn the loss of her son, because John lost all his personality. Still, despite all this tragedy, Deborah said that she still had hope that one day Nick would turn over a new leaf and stop putting people at risk. But even with all that, she wasn't done. Deborah also wanted the authorities to remember and include the crash that happened almost 20 years ago in how they handled Nick's current DUI arrest, which makes sense, because it seems like going to jail, being on probation, losing his license, and having to complete several hours of community service were not enough to get Nick on the straight and narrow when it comes to driving. So far, it looks like Nick's arrest is only going to be a misdemeanor, but it could still get a lot worse, and Nick could get severely punished. But what do you guys think? Do you think Nick is actually going to change his ways? Should the authorities take his past into account? Let me know what you think in the comments below.